The Atomic Betrayal: How America Destroyed Its Own Prometheus. April 12, 1954, a Monday. A light, miserable rain was falling over Washington, D.C., slicking the sidewalks of Constitution Avenue where the cherry blossoms were already beginning to rot. Inside a nondescript gray structure known as Building T3, the gears of history were grinding with a harsh, metallic sound. This building was never meant to be permanent. It was a temporary structure thrown up during the frantic days of the Second World War, intended to be torn down once peace returned. Yet, there it stood, dilapidated, drafty, with a ventilation system that wheezed like a dying man. If you had walked into room 2022 that morning, you would have been forgiven for thinking you had stumbled into a janitor's closet or a forgotten storage room. It certainly did not look like a place where the fate of a nation's scientific soul would be decided. The room was narrow, claustrophobic, and windowless. The only decoration was a map of the United States pinned to a peeling wall. A few mismatched wooden tables were shoved together, and the air was thick with the stale, suffocating smell of old paper, damp carpet, and heavy cigarette smoke. This was the execution chamber the United States government had prepared for J. Robert Oppenheimer. At 9 o'clock, the door opened. Oppenheimer walked in. If you wound the clock back just 9 years, his appearance in public would have been met with blinding flashbulbs and adoring crowds. Back then, he was the man in the wide-brimmed pork pie hat, the man with the eyes of a prophet. He was the father of the atomic bomb, the hero who had ended the bloodiest war in human history. They said he held the power of the sun in his hands. But the man entering room 2022 today looked like a ghost. He had just turned 50, but he carried the weariness of a man of 70. His cheeks were hollowed out, skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes, which once a piercing glacial blue, were now rimmed with red and filled with a quiet terror. He sat down, his fingers trembling with a nervous energy, instinctively reaching for his lighter. Over the next 4 weeks, he would chain-smoke hundreds of cigarettes in this room, one after another, as if the smoke were the only oxygen keeping him alive.
Sitting across from him were not Soviet interrogators, nor were they enemies from the war. They were his countrymen. They were a special board of inquiry hand-picked by the Atomic Energy Commission. On the table between them lay a stack of files 3,000 pages thick. Inside were transcripts of phone calls illegally wiretapped by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. There were surveillance reports filed by agents who had shadowed him for a decade. There were intimate letters written to lovers in the 1930s. Every word he had ever written about love, idealism, or his naive political fantasies was about to be placed under a microscope, dissected, read aloud, and weaponized as proof of treason. This was not a trial. In a court of law, the accused has the right to see the evidence against him. But here, Oppenheimer did not even know what cards the prosecution held. This was a carefully orchestrated humiliation. It was a public execution in slow motion. And the director of this tragedy was not sitting in the room. He was hiding in an office next door, or perhaps further away, pulling the strings through memos and telephone calls. Lewis Strauss, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, was waiting coldly for the result. Many historians will tell you that this happened because of the Cold War. They will say it was the result of the Soviet atomic bomb test, or the Red Scare whipped up by Senator Joseph McCarthy. Those are the grand textbook explanations. But if you peel away the layers of political rhetoric, you will find that the core engine of this destruction was shockingly small and tragically human. This was not about national security. This was not about nuclear secrets. This was a story about a 10-year feud between two men. It is a story of how arrogance provoked insecurity and how deep-seated jealousy was transmuted into a force of absolute destruction. Today, we are going to push open that heavy door and walk into the minds of these two men. We are going to see how a single joke destroyed an era. To understand the trial of 1954, we must wind the clock back to the early 20th century and look at how these two men were forged in completely different worlds. Robert Oppenheimer was born into the clouds. He was the eldest son of a wealthy Jewish family on New York's Upper West Side. His childhood was wrapped in velvet, art, and intellectualism. If you walked into the Oppenheimer apartment on Riverside Drive, you didn't see ordinary furniture. You saw original Van Goghs and Renoirs hanging on the walls. Young Robert was a prodigy, overprotected and isolated. He didn't play stickball with the kids on the street. His friends were minerals and poetry. By the age of 11, he was writing letters to the New York Mineralogical Club using such sophisticated terminology that when they invited him to speak, they were shocked to find they had to fetch a wooden crate for the expert to stand on so he could reach the podium. His path was paved with gold: Harvard, Cambridge, Göttingen. He drifted through the great scientific cathedrals of Europe, mastering quantum mechanics as easily as he breathed. For Oppenheimer, understanding the mysteries of the universe was easy. What was difficult was understanding ordinary people. This smooth, privileged existence created a fatal flaw in his character, a naive yet cruel arrogance. There is a story often repeated by biographers, though few truly examine its psychological weight. During his time at Cambridge, the young Oppenheimer, frustrated by his own clumsiness in the lab and critical feedback from his tutor, Patrick Blackett, injected a poison into an apple and left it on his tutor's desk. It was for all intents and purposes an attempted murder. While his father's wealth and influence quietly made the problem go away, Oppenheimer was merely sent to a psychiatrist. The incident revealed a darkness in his soul. He believed he was special. He believed he was above the rules. When he felt slighted, his reaction was not self-reflection, but a desire to destroy the source of his pain. On the other end of the spectrum, Lewis Strauss was fighting his way out of the mud. Strauss was also born into a Jewish family, but his world had no Van Goghs. It had only ledgers and the crushing weight of making ends meet. When he graduated high school, Strauss was the valedictorian. His greatest dream was to study physics, to understand the laws of God's creation. But that year, a recession hit. His father's business collapsed. The dream of university evaporated. It became the wound he would carry for the rest of his life. Imagine the contrast. While Oppenheimer was reading Dante in the libraries of Harvard, young Lewis Strauss was lugging a heavy sample case down the dusty roads of the American South, selling shoes door to door. But Strauss possessed a terrifying, almost paranoid resilience. Between sales calls, he taught himself law. He taught himself finance. Like a starving wolf, he hunted for every opportunity to climb. Eventually, through sheer business acumen and social maneuvering, he clawed his way into Kuhn, Loeb & Co., one of Wall Street's most prestigious firms. He became a millionaire. Strauss succeeded. He wore the most expensive suits tailored in London. He lived in a mansion. During the Second World War, he even acquired the honorary rank of Admiral Strauss. He insisted that everyone address him as Admiral Strauss, even though he had never commanded a ship in battle. And this was Strauss's Achilles heel. He was desperate for recognition. He was agonizingly concerned with whether he was respected. He donated fortunes to scientific laboratories and sat on boards, all to scrub away the stain of the shoe salesman. He wanted to prove he belonged in the circle of the intellectual elite. Fate pushed these two men together. One was a scientist who craved power. The other was a businessman who craved wisdom. It should have been a complementary partnership. But the problem was that Oppenheimer looked down on Strauss. With those eyes that could see through atomic structures, he saw Strauss not as a peer, but as a pretender in a fancy suit, a nouveau riche merchant trying to buy his way into the temple of knowledge. The tragedy truly began in 1947, in the idyllic setting of Princeton, New Jersey. That year, Strauss made one of the proudest decisions of his life. Using his wealth and influence as a trustee, he personally invited Oppenheimer to become the director of the Institute of Advanced Study. This was an academic Eden. Einstein walked these grounds. Gödel pondered mathematics here. Strauss saw himself as the guardian of this garden, and Oppenheimer was the high priest he had chosen to lead it. Strauss provided Oppenheimer with a grand residence, Olden Manor, and a handsome salary. In his mind, this was a benevolent gift, the beginning of a deep friendship. He fantasized about sitting by the fireplace with Oppenheimer discussing the origins of the cosmos like two equal sages. But reality delivered a stinging slap to the face. When Oppenheimer arrived at Princeton, he showed none of the gratitude Strauss expected. Instead, he brought a suffocating air of superiority. The friction permeated every detail of their interactions, even down to the pronunciation of a name. Strauss was a Southern Jew desperate to assimilate into the American upper crust. He insisted that his surname be pronounced Strauss, a Virginia affectation that sounded less foreign, more genteel. But Oppenheimer, the scholar of languages, always made a point of pronouncing it the German way, Strauss. Every time he said it in public, it was a reminder. Don't forget, you are the son of an immigrant. No matter how expensive your suit is, you are still the shoe salesman. It was a tiny, continuous paper cut to Strauss's soul. Oppenheimer was likely unaware of the damage he was doing, or perhaps he just didn't care.
Even worse, Oppenheimer frequently humiliated Strauss in academic meetings. Strauss loved physics, but he lacked formal education. When he tried to offer an opinion, Oppenheimer would sometimes interrupt him, speaking in a tone one might use with a slow child. "Lewis, I think this matter is a bit too complex for you. Let me use simple words." There would be scattered laughter in the room. Strauss would smile along, but his eyes remained dead. This was Oppenheimer's blind spot. He thought it was just intellectual honesty. He didn't understand that for a man like Strauss, a man who had clawed his way up from nothing, this patronizing pity was far more wounding than an insult. Strauss swallowed the humiliation, recording it in his diary, waiting like a crocodile beneath the surface for the moment to strike. And Oppenheimer, oblivious to the danger, continued to stride through the corridors of Washington, making enemies with his wit and his brilliance. He didn't know he was walking toward a cliff. If the earlier frictions were just gunpowder piling up, then a congressional hearing in June 1949 was the spark. On that day, Oppenheimer committed the most expensive mistake of his life. He stripped Strauss of his dignity in front of the entire country. The context was specific. Congress was debating whether to export radioactive isotopes to allies like Norway. To the scientific community, this was trivial. These isotopes were for medical research and useless for weapons. But it was the dawn of the Cold War, and fear had gripped Washington. Strauss, the hardliner, vehemently opposed the export. He stubbornly believed that any nuclear material leaving American shores would eventually end up in Soviet hands. The hearing was held in a large Senate chamber. Strauss spoke first, his tone grave, bordering on hysterical, painting the isotopes as a matter of national survival. Then it was Oppenheimer's turn. Oppenheimer took the stand. He was relaxed, confident. He could have offered Strauss a graceful exit, explaining the technical details politely. But he didn't. Perhaps he was in a bad mood, or perhaps he simply couldn't abide Strauss's ignorance anymore. He decided to unleash his trademark, devastating wit. Senator Burke Hickenlooper, an ally of Strauss, asked Oppenheimer, "Doctor, couldn't these isotopes be used to make an atomic bomb?" Oppenheimer leaned back, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He glanced at Strauss, then turned to the microphone and delivered the line that would seal his fate.
No one can force me to say that you cannot use these isotopes for atomic energy. You can use a shovel for atomic energy. In fact, you can do it with a bottle of beer. And you can do it with a shovel. But as a practical matter, a shovel is far more helpful in making a bomb than these isotopes. The room exploded with laughter. It was a raucous, mocking laughter. The press laughed, the senators laughed, even the stenographer chuckled. It was the laughter of the in-crowd mocking the village idiot. Oppenheimer had used a simple metaphor, a shovel and a bottle of beer, to turn Strauss's grave national security concerns into a farce. News photographers captured Strauss's face at that moment. He sat next to Oppenheimer, jaw clenched tight, face ashen, staring straight ahead. His body was rigid. In that instant, he realized that, to Oppenheimer, he was not a partner. He was not a friend. He was a punchline. After the hearing, Oppenheimer left like a victorious matador. Strauss slipped out a side door. But an aide later recalled that Strauss's silence that day was more terrifying than any shout. As one biographer noted, in that moment, Lewis Strauss swore an oath. If he could not beat Oppenheimer in physics, he would destroy him in the only arena that mattered, the game of power. From that day on, this was no longer a policy dispute. It was a blood feud. Strauss was a patient hunter. He knew that to bring down a national icon like Oppenheimer, he couldn't attack frontally. He had to wait for the winds to shift. A few months later, history gave him his opening. In August 1949, on the steppes of Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, WWII. The news hit Washington like a sledgehammer. The American monopoly on the apocalypse was over. Panic spread like a virus. Politicians screamed for answers. How did the Russians get the bomb so fast? There must be spies. There must be a leak. In this atmosphere of terror, a new monster emerged. The hydrogen bomb. The super. Scientists led by Edward Teller argued that America must immediately build a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb to maintain dominance. Strauss was a fanatic supporter of the H-bomb. He saw it as the only means of survival. But Oppenheimer stood in the way. By this time, Oppenheimer was no longer the man who raced to build the gadget. After seeing the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he was haunted by the hell he had unleashed. He had once told President Truman, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." As chairman of the General Advisory Committee, Oppenheimer led the top scientists in a unanimous decision. They opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb. He wrote, "It is a weapon of genocide. If you use it, you cannot stand upright morally." This report enraged Strauss. To him, Oppenheimer was not just wrong, he was dangerous. Strauss began to drip poison into the ears of Washington's elite. He stopped calling Oppenheimer arrogant. That wasn't a crime. He began to question Oppenheimer's motives. He whispered to President Eisenhower's advisors, "Why is Oppenheimer so stubbornly blocking the H-bomb? He's a smart man. Can't he see the Soviet threat? Unless he doesn't want America to win." It was a vicious logical trap. If you oppose the bigger bomb, you want the Soviets to catch up. If you want the Soviets to catch up, you are a traitor. Strauss recruited a powerful ally, J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Hoover already despised Oppenheimer. They opened the old files. Oppenheimer's past was indeed littered with vulnerabilities. His wife was a communist. His brother was a communist. His mistress in the 30s was a communist. In the Great Depression, this was common among intellectuals. But in the hysteria of the 1950s, these old associations were converted into evidence of treason. Strauss wove the net personally. He ordered Hoover to intensify the surveillance. Phones were tapped, mail was opened. Agents went through Oppenheimer's trash. They didn't need proof that he sold secrets because he hadn't. They needed dirt that could destroy his character.
By the winter of 1953, the trap was set. The final push came in the form of a letter. Strauss quietly encouraged a pawn, a former congressional staffer named William Borden, to write a top-secret letter to the FBI. Borden's letter reached a shocking conclusion. He didn't say Oppenheimer was a security risk. He wrote unequivocally, "More probably than not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is an agent of the Soviet Union." The letter landed on President Eisenhower's desk like a grenade. Eisenhower was a pragmatist. He didn't truly believe Oppenheimer was a spy, but he couldn't take the risk. If McCarthy found out the White House was harboring a suspected traitor, the administration would fall. Eisenhower issued the famous blank wall order, immediately cut off Oppenheimer from all state secrets. What happened next played out like a scene from a gangster movie. On December 21st, Strauss summoned Oppenheimer to his office. It was a freezing afternoon. It was a game of cat and mouse. Strauss feigned mercy. He handed Oppenheimer a draft of the charges and gave him two choices. Choice 1, resign quietly. We will tell the public it was due to health reasons or a contract expiration. You keep your reputation, you exit with dignity. Choice 2, refuse to resign and demand a hearing. But if you do, everything in this file, your women, your lies, your past, will be laid bare for the world to see. Strauss sat there watching Oppenheimer. He was gambling. He bet that Oppenheimer would choose to save face. Any ordinary politician would have resigned immediately to stop the bleeding. But Strauss underestimated Oppenheimer's arrogance and his naivety. Oppenheimer looked at the man he had once mocked as a lowly shoe salesman. He could not fathom losing to him. He believed that with his eloquence, his logic, and his service to the nation, he could talk his way out of anything. Oppenheimer replied coldly, "Lewis, it looks like you are trying to get me to resign." Strauss answered with a face of stone. "It is your choice, Robert." The next day, Oppenheimer wrote a letter refusing to resign. He said to resign would be to accept these charges. At that moment, Strauss likely smiled in his office. This was exactly what he wanted. If Oppenheimer resigned, he merely lost a job. But if he fought, Strauss could destroy him completely. Oppenheimer thought he was walking into a fair court. He didn't know he was walking into a slaughterhouse. Let us return to April 1954, to that suffocating room 2022. The hearing was now in its third week. If the first 2 weeks were torture, this was the butchery. Strauss did not appear in court personally. He didn't need to. He had hired a sharp dagger in the form of Roger Robb. Robb was not a normal lawyer. He was a prosecutor known for his brutality. He was built like a bulldog and he smelled blood. Strauss's instruction to Robb was simple. Do not treat him as a witness. Treat him as a liar. The fight was rigged. Robb held the secret FBI files. He knew every conversation Oppenheimer had had for 10 years. Oppenheimer had only his fading memory. Every time Oppenheimer tried to explain a detail, Robb would sneer, pull out a document, and prove him wrong. Then Robb went for the jugular. He attacked Oppenheimer's private life. He knew the point of maximum pain. Jean Tatlock, the depressive communist, the love of Oppenheimer's life, who had committed suicide 10 years prior. Robb read the intimate details of their affair aloud to the room. He forced Oppenheimer to answer. Why did you see her after you were married? What did you do in her apartment? Did you spend the night? It wasn't about leaks. It was about shame. Oppenheimer sat there, stripped naked before his peers, sweat pouring down his face. And then the Chevalier incident. Years ago, a friend had approached Oppenheimer about Soviet contacts. Oppenheimer had refused, but to protect his friend, he had told a lie to military intelligence. It was a stupid mistake, born of loyalty. Now it was the noose. Robb pressed him. Doctor, why did you lie to the intelligence officer? Were you protecting a spy? Oppenheimer broke. Under weeks of pressure, insomnia, and humiliation, the genius's mind went blank. He looked down, his voice barely a whisper. The tape recorder captured the heartbreaking confession. Because I was an idiot. The room went silent. It wasn't humility. It was total self-destruction. The man who had once mocked Strauss was now admitting he was a fool. Strauss, reading the transcripts later, must have been satisfied. He had broken Oppenheimer's spirit. But the deepest cut did not come from the prosecutor. It came from a colleague. Toward the end of the hearing, a special witness entered the room. Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb. He walked with a limp, his eyebrows thick, his eyes burning with an ambition that matched Oppenheimer's. In the scientific tribe, there is an unwritten rule. Scientists do not attack scientists. They stand together against the politicians. But Strauss had gotten to Teller. He offered a tacit deal. If Oppenheimer falls, you will be the new king of American science. Teller took the stand. Robb asked the decisive question. Dr. Teller, do you consider Dr. Oppenheimer a security risk? Teller paused. He looked at Oppenheimer, the man who had led him at Los Alamos. And then Teller delivered the most carefully crafted, lethal testimony in scientific history. I thoroughly believe Dr. Oppenheimer is loyal. However, in a great number of cases, I have seen Dr. Oppenheimer act in a way which, for me, was exceedingly hard to understand. His actions confused me. To this extent, I feel that I would like to see the vital interests of this country in hands that I understand better, and therefore trust more. It sounded polite. In reality, it was a knife in the back. To say you cannot understand a man's judgment is to say he cannot be trusted with the button. Teller had just pronounced the death sentence. On May 27, 1954, the verdict came down. By a vote of 2-1, the Atomic Energy Commission ruled Oppenheimer was loyal, but he had fundamental defects of character. His security clearance was permanently revoked. In that moment, J. Robert Oppenheimer died. His heart was beating, but his life as a public figure, as the Prometheus of his age, was over. He became a living ghost. Strauss won. It was the perfect murder. No blood spilled, but the adversary was buried. In the following years, Strauss reigned supreme. He graced the cover of Time magazine. He was Eisenhower's right hand. He thought he had finally scrubbed away the scent of the shoe salesman and joined the pantheon of great men. But he forgot the most basic law of physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Or, in older terms, pride goeth before a fall. In 1959, Strauss reached for the crown. President Eisenhower nominated him for Secretary of Commerce. It was the cabinet position he had dreamed of. It should have been a formality. But he didn't realize that the silent physicists had not forgotten the spring of 1954. At the Senate confirmation hearing, the storm broke. The scientists organized. They came out of their labs to avenge their fallen leader. An obscure physicist named David Hill took the stand. He looked unremarkable, nervous even. Strauss, sitting behind him, smirked, expecting nothing. But Hill opened his mouth and roared. He didn't talk about physics. He talked about character. He pointed a finger at Strauss and told the Senate, this nominee, in his treatment of Oppenheimer, has shown a vindictive streak. He distorts facts, he is small-minded. To let such a man into the cabinet would be an insult to the integrity of this nation. Hill's testimony tore away Strauss's gentlemanly mask. The cameras turned to Strauss, and for the first time he lost control. Just as he had when Oppenheimer mocked him years ago, Strauss's ego couldn't take it. He raged at the hearing, calling witnesses liars, appearing arrogant, paranoid, and petty. The senators were shocked. They didn't see a statesman. They saw a bully. On June 19, 1959, the Senate voted. The result was 46-49. Strauss was rejected. It was the first time in half a century that a cabinet nominee had been voted down. Strauss's political career shattered just inches from the finish line. That night, Strauss left Capitol Hill alone. He thought destroying Oppenheimer would earn him respect. Instead, it revealed his ugliness to the world. There were no winners in this tragedy. Oppenheimer retreated to academia, a shell of his former self. His hair turned white. He moved to a small beach house on the island of St. John, spending his days walking by the water, watching the tides. He rarely spoke of physics or politics again. He died of throat cancer in 1967, at the age of 62. Years before his death, President Lyndon Johnson tried to offer an olive branch, awarding him the Fermi Award. At the ceremony, leaning on a cane, Oppenheimer looked at the president and said his final, haunting words, "Mr. President,
I think it is just possible that you have taken some charity and some courage to make this award today. Until the end, he was the observer who saw the truth but could not change the outcome. As for Lewis Strauss, though he lived into his 80s, wealthy and comfortable, his legacy was ash. He wrote long memoirs trying to justify his actions, claiming he was the patriot and the victim. But history had already cast the verdict.
He is remembered only as the villain whose jealousy destroyed a genius. When we look back at this history, we do not see a spy thriller, we see a Greek tragedy. Oppenheimer possessed the wisdom to understand the universe, but not the wisdom to hide his brilliance. Strauss possessed the skill to acquire power, but not the power to cure his own insecurity. History is not always decided by grand ideologies or great armies. Sometimes, the fate of the world turns on a look across a room, an arrogant joke, and a grudge that refuses to die. Prometheus stole fire from the gods to light the darkness of man, but he was not destroyed by the wrath of Zeus. He was destroyed by the envy of men. This has been a story from our archives. Thank you for spending this time in the shadows of history. In a world full of arrogance and prejudice, how do we find our footing? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next story.